Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
When most think of great Olympic boxing champions, memories of Sugar Ray Leonard, Muhammad Ali, George Foreman. Those are the guys that come to mind. Few, however, think of perhaps the greatest Olympic boxing champion of all time. A man who was a hero to an entire nation. Only that nation is not the U.S., it's Cuba. And the Olympic champion? Teofilo Stevenson. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, a look back at the career of Teofilo Stevenson, the only boxer to win 3 straight Olympic heavyweight gold medals.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. In just a moment, Tom Clark will be joining me to talk about Teofilo Stevenson. Tom has written several books, including Death in the Ring, a very unique and fictional look at the sport of boxing. But before we go there, let's talk about Stevenson. You know, when I was researching, as I like to call them, Forgotten Heroes, I debated whether or not I should include Teofilo Stevenson. The reason being, he's not an American. But then I thought to myself, why should that exclude him? I remember watching him fight in the Olympics, and I remember a lot of talk about him turning pro and fighting the likes of Ali and Foreman. But those fights never materialized because Stevenson never turned pro. So should that exclude him? Nah, I don't think so, because the fact is, he was a hero to the people of Cuba. Not a military or dastardly hero, but a sports hero. And after all, isn't that what this podcast is about? And to many, listening to Sports Forgotten Heroes, Stevenson is forgotten. And to some, maybe they've never even heard of him. So here you go. He was awesome, as powerful as they came. And at 6'5", he was an intimidating figure. He took up the sport of boxing around the age of 9 and learned under the guidance of Cuba's national lightweight champion, John Herrera. And Herrera recognized Stevenson's ability in the ring, and it wasn't long before Stevenson joined Cuba's national team, 1970. And at the age of 20, the youngster, now the top heavyweight in Cuba, was picked to represent Cuba in the 1972 Summer Olympic Games in Munich. Now, before Tom Clark joins the podcast, just a little business. I'd like to thank Hall of Fame supporters Henry R. from New Jersey and Jack K. from Las Vegas. I'd also like to thank my friends at the Hungry Cliff Podcast and the Hearthcast Podcast for all their support. To learn how you can become a supporter or sponsor of Sports Forgotten Heroes, check out our page at patreon.com/sportsfh. That's patreon.com/sportsfh. There you can see the different reward levels we offer, including how you can participate in a future podcast. You can also go to sportsfh.com for a link and to check out past episodes as well. And you can also see who else is coming up on future podcasts. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes or search for our page on Facebook. Tom Clark has written several articles on the sport of boxing and has a terrific book out called Death in the Ring. And even though a lot of what he writes about is fictional, to make it believable, the research is unreal, cannot be understated. And his book, Death in the Ring, is proof of that. He is also one of the few to write about Teofilo Stevenson. Tom, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Tell me about your book, Death in the Ring, and where fans of this podcast can get a copy of it.
Well, Death in the Ring is available on Amazon.com, both in the Kindle electronic format as well as the paperback format. So it's very easy to get. Also, generally, you can go into a bookstore, any bookstore, and order it. That would be through the paperback version. It's divided into two parts. The first part is fantasies, and I thought it would be fun to just kind of, in a literary way, speculate on what some of the great champions and fighters in the past were like, such as John L. Sullivan, Peter Jackson, the great black fighter, and Sam Langford, Harry Greb, many others, right on through Dempsey and Tunney. And then once we get into the modern age, I had a number of nonfiction articles. I met Archie Moore back in 1980 and wrote an article on him at the time, so I updated that. So I've covered many of the champions back from the bare knuckle days. Jack Sullivan, the last bare knuckle champion, right on through the contemporary guys, including Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao.
So when we're talking about what a fight might have been, one of the great topics is how good a professional fighter a guy like Teofilo Stevenson might have been. And some think he might have actually been the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. And then there are those who think he was just a great amateur and wouldn't have made it as a professional. What's your opinion and why?
Teofilo, beyond question, and George Foreman, I was in reviewing material, I saw interviews with George Foreman that I had seen years before. And I agree with Foreman that Stevenson had as much raw talent as any heavyweight who's ever lived. Now, that doesn't mean he was a perfect fighter. No one has ever been perfect or ever will be. But he had tremendous size. He was 6'5". He had athleticism. He could move, had extremely long arms. And, of course, he had the single most powerful right hand in the history of boxing. He could deliver it after the left jab, or he could just throw the lead right. And when he hit people, he generally hit them either on the jaw, of course, or the side of the head. And people went down as if they were poleaxed. Now, regarding, and of course he dominated the amateurs, we should note that he beat 3 fighters at least who went on to own portions of the heavyweight title.
Sure.
Those being Michael Dokes, John Tate, Tony Tubbs, and he also beat guys who went on to have very good pro careers like Dwayne Bobbick and Tyrell Biggs. So he undoubtedly would have been a major factor in the division. However, we also need to note that he spent his entire career as an amateur. He had more than 300 fights, and that means a 3-round limit. So he was not fighting. I mean, he continued into full manhood, into his, right up into his peak and beyond as an amateur, and he was fighting guys who were younger. Now, that doesn't take away from his great talent or his achievement as an amateur, but he, for example, lost twice to the banger out of the Soviet Union, Igor Vysotsky. And Vysotsky knocked out Stevenson in one of those fights. It is inconceivable, despite the fact that Vysotsky was a fine fighter, it's inconceivable that Vysotsky would have stopped Muhammad Ali, for example, or that he would have stopped George Foreman. So I believe that he would have been a tremendously effective heavyweight. He would have knocked out a lot of people, but he would also, from time to time, would have been knocked out, which, again, that happens to most fighters anyway. But I think he would have owned at least one of the titles for a time. After all, the fighters I named who he beat as amateurs, he could have beaten them as professionals. I'll review them. Michael Dokes, John Tate, and Tony Tubbs, very fine fighters. But certainly, if they won titles, shares of titles, and they did, then we have to assume that Teofilo Stevenson would have done that and more.
As As you noted, he was only fought as an amateur, so his fights were 3-round fights. So he never really trained to go 12 or 15 rounds. So was the fact that he was such a great amateur boxer, was that because he trained just for 3-round fights? And is there something different when you only train for 3-round fights as opposed for training for 12 or a long time ago 15-round fights?
Right. Well, in the case of Stevenson, we always have to start with his tremendous athleticism, his size, 6'5", as I mentioned, the long arms, the extraordinary power in the right hand. You can't teach or even work to develop the kind of power Stevenson has. Now, we're lucky we have YouTube. We can get on YouTube and go back and watch Stevenson's fights or Ali's or any number of events in and out of sports. And when you watch Stevenson, you're just struck by how time and time again throughout his career, he hits a person once or twice with the right hand, and their history, they're just down. And I use the term poleaxe, and it's appropriate. It's like like you see cattle hit with a bang stick, and boom, they drop. That is what you always have to think of when you think of Stevenson, a guy with extraordinary talent. Now, regarding his training, of course, I think that he didn't, not that it mattered since he didn't fight professionals, but he didn't reach his potential, because guys who are training for 12 and 15 round fights and who are going against guys who are at their absolute peak, Ali Frazier kind of fights, Ali Foreman, those guys would have handled Stevenson as he was as an amateur. Now, we don't know what he would have been as a pro. Now, I've got his record right here, 302 wins, 22 losses as an amateur. Had he had, say, 50 fights as a professional, he would have been, I believe, far better than anything we saw. But what we did see was magnificent. We don't have to gnash our teeth about what we so much missed with Stevenson, because we saw extraordinary achievements in the Olympics, three Olympic crowns, gold medals, 3 world championships in the amateur ranks. And it would have been great, of course, to see him have some super fights with Ali or Foreman.
His Olympic record is incredible. He's the only heavyweight to win 3 gold medals, and he might have won a 4th had Cuba not boycotted the '84 Olympics in Los Angeles. Tell me about Tell me about his career as an Olympic boxer and the fact that he did beat so many future champions like John Tate.
Right. Well, in the '72 Olympics, a guy named Dwayne Bobbick was the favorite. He had beaten the 19-year-old Stevenson the year before. He had decisioned him. It was a close decision, 3-2 for Bobbick. So Bobbick went in. He was the banger and the more mature guy, a little bit older than Stevenson. And he was considered, frankly, the great white hope. And so anyway, they met in the '72 Olympics. And Stevenson absolutely annihilated him, put him down a couple of times, each time with the right hand, of course. And the second time, Bobbick, and I note this in my article, Bobbick was actually in the fetal position. And that's not a criticism of Bobbick. It just shows you the extraordinary power of Stevenson. So that was how the world got to know Stevenson. He was unknown internationally until the '72 Olympics, but his talent was unmistakable. Then in the '76 Olympics, he went against another talented American, John Tate, who we talked about would go on to win one of the heavyweight titles. And he knocked Tate out. He hit him with a right hand in the first round. I remember it so well. And Tate, the referee waved his hands for a standing 8 count, and Tate starts walking to his right and gets over to the corner and then just collapses. It was a delayed reaction knockout, which can be among the most devastating. And so that was his second gold medal. And then in 1980, the U.S. didn't participate because of the boycott following Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. But certainly Stevenson would have beaten anyone the U.S. put up against him in 1980. And as you say, if it hadn't been for the response, the Soviet bloc boycotting the U.S. Olympics as punishment for the U.S. boycott in 1980, I fully believe that Stevenson would have won in '84 as well.
The boycott. The 1980s Summer Olympics were held in Moscow, and in fact, it was the first time ever that the Olympics were held in Eastern Europe and in a socialist country. At the time, however, the Soviet Union was at war with Afghanistan, and our president, Jimmy Carter, threatened to boycott the Olympics unless the Soviets pulled out. Of course, that didn't happen. So the U.S., along with 65 other countries, and these included places like Canada and Israel, Japan, and West Germany, they didn't show up. So Stevenson won the gold for the third straight time, thus becoming the first boxer ever to win gold in the same division 3 straight times. In 1972 at Munich, he won his first fight by TKO in 30 seconds. Knocked Dwayne Bobick to the canvas 3 times in the third round of the quarterfinals before the referees stopped the fight. Scored a semifinal TKO over German fighter Peter Hussing in the second round, and won the gold medal when Ion Alexei of Romania couldn't fight because of injury. In 1976, Stevenson won by a second-round knockout in his first match, a first-round knockout in the quarters, and then in the semis, he knocked out John Tate in the first round. And if you want to see that fight, and for that matter, other fights of Teofilo Stevenson, I have a link to them and the fight against John Tate on sportsfh.com. In the gold medal round, Stevenson scored a TKO in the third round over Mircea Simon of Romania. In 1980, Stevenson was at it again. He won his first match by knockout in the first round, won his second match with a knockout in the third round, won his semifinal match with a unanimous 5-0 decision, and then defeated Peter Zayev 4-1 to win his third straight gold medal, Zayev of the Soviet Union. However, the powerful righty never had a chance to go for a fourth straight gold because of another boycott. This time, it was the Soviets' turn. The Olympics were held on U.S. soil, Los Angeles, and the USSR claimed it did not boycott the Olympics in retaliation for 1980, wink wink. Rather, the Soviets cited security concerns. And in support of the Soviet Union, Cuba, along with Bulgaria, East Germany, Mongolia, Vietnam, Laos, and Czechoslovakia, all boycotted as well. Tyrell Biggs of the U.S. capitalized on Stevenson's absence and won the gold by defeating Francesco Damiani by a 4-1 decision. Incidentally, previous to the 1984 Olympics, Biggs and Stevenson faced each other twice, and each time Stevenson came out on top. Yeah, Stevenson beat several big-name boxers, and like we said, he was as powerful as they came. Let's talk a little bit about his proficiency in the ring. You noted that he was just a powerful puncher. What made him so good? Where did that power come from?
Well, first of all, certainly no one, I mean, the laws of physics would dictate that no one is going to hit as hard as Stevenson, that is, to put heavyweights down like they were kids almost, bam. Now, so size is part of it. Being 6'5" with the long arms, and you have tremendous leverage. And if you look at the photos of Stevenson or watching them on video, you see his musculature is very impressive. He's tremendously well built. But the tremendous knockout power that Stevenson had, or any time a fighter has some great knockout power, that's a natural gift. It's just like a pitcher with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. You can work hard and develop yourself and enhance your inherent gifts, but you're not going to be, this all-pro, all-world specimen in any sport, in this case boxing, unless you just have the gift. And, of course, Stevenson was a very hard worker, though. I mean, he, as we noted, had more than 300 amateur fights at the highest level. So, he was just a guy with a tremendous gift who worked hard. And really, after normally, let's say in the United States, in most Western countries, if a guy had that kind of talent after the 72 Olympics, when he was 20 years old and he'd gone out there and dominated people, he would have signed a major contract and would have become quite wealthy in his early and mid-20s and would have won a share of some title. But again, in that period, early to mid-70s and beyond, you're talking about the golden era of heavyweights. Ali, Frazier, Foreman, then a little later, Larry Holmes in 78. Larry Holmes became champion. I'm a little biased, since maybe the hometown guys, but I think I'm also objective for the most part. And I think any of those four champions, those great heavyweight champions I just mentioned, I think that they would take Stevenson. At least the Stevenson that we saw. If we had seen a Stevenson who had fought 10, 12, and even 15-round fights, we would have seen an even more formidable Stevenson.
Yeah, there are many who believe had he turned professional, he could have stopped Ali. Of course, it's all conjecture. Yeah. How would have a fight like that turned out? Would he have been able to even hang with a guy like Ali or Foreman or Frazier? Could he have hung?
First of all, I don't think even if he had been a full-time professional that he would have knocked out Ali. Ali was a guy you simply didn't knock out in his prime. He was only stopped out, or even after his prime. He was only stopped after a 2-year layoff when he came back far too late in life at age 38 against the great Larry Holmes. We know history teaches us if fighters stay around too long, they're not only going to get beat, they're going to get beat up. So that was unfortunate that the great Ali came back. But in my view, even if Stevenson was, he definitely gets knocked out by Foreman and Ali and Larry Holmes. He gets picked apart and beaten. I don't see him knocking out. Ali had a great chin. So did Foreman, and so did Larry Holmes. He certainly can hurt any man who's ever lived if he hits him on the chin. But it's an easy question. The Stevenson that we saw, the amateur Stevenson, didn't develop to the degree that these guys did by turning pro and fighting the greatest fighters and doing it over 10 rounds and up to 15. We have to say that Stevenson, because of all of this talent that he had, if he had fought as a pro, we have to give him a shot at, let's say, beating Ali. I don't see him knocking out Ali. And again, when it comes to getting knocked out, Igor Vysotsky knocked out Stevenson. And that's not a criticism because Vysotsky was a very tough guy and became friendly with Stevenson, after their career. But I think at the time this was something much discussed, and I think it still is discussed. And I think we would have to say it's in order to have a chance against those Ali, Foreman, Frazier, and Holmes, he would have to have developed as a pro.
Right, and that means he would have had to have fought a couple of 12-round fights, 15-round fights. He only fought 3-round fights.
That's right. One thing I write about in Death in the Ring is the damage that boxers sustain, as the title would indicate. And even in amateur boxing, I think we see this. They don't fight these horrific, 12 or 15-round fights as they used to, but they fight, in the case of Stevenson, more than 300 times. So I think what I get into later in the article is that Stevenson probably sustained some brain damage. I don't mean in terms of dementia pugilistica, but he wasn't punch drunk per se, but he had some emotional problems. And some years ago, I was reading about him online, and I'll give a credit here to a British writer named Bryn Jonathan Butler, had an interview with Stevenson in Cuba, and he paid Stevenson something on the order of $150 for the right to interview Stevenson for 75 minutes. And when he arrived at Stevenson's house in the morning, Stevenson was intoxicated, was drinking straight vodka out of, I think, a plastic bottle, and was chain smoking cigarettes, and was quite skinny and, essentially frail, very gray. And, so we can see that he was a guy who would in fact die at age 60, which happened in 2012. Incidentally, Stevenson was born the same year as I, which was 1952. From 24 years, I taught English as a second language for adults, and here in Bakersfield, California, 110 miles north of Los Angeles. And most of my students, 80% roughly, I mean, we had students from all over the world, but 80% were from Mexico. But as I mentioned in the story, one day I heard an accent that was not a Mexican accent. And I asked this guy, so where are you from, in Spanish? I said, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Cuba. And Stevenson had just died, so this was probably 2012. And I said, yeah, it's too bad he died so young. What happened? And he said Stevenson had a lot of problems with alcohol, with drugs, and with women. And so we often see this in boxers because, it's the brutal nature of the sport combined with the blows to the head. And they just, it's a tragic combination.
Even when you're only fighting 3 rounds, when you're fighting 320-something fights, it's got to take its toll.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and with fighters, it's not only their fights, which is, of course, on a minute-by-minute basis where they're going to take the most punishment, but they spend thousands and thousands of rounds over, say, a 20-year period in the gym. And those hits count, too. Ali started boxing when he was 12 years old. And, so you're getting hit as a kid. The Quarry Brothers, both of whom died of dementia pugilistica when they were in their 50s and are buried not far from where I stand right now. They're buried up in Shafter, California, where the family lived when they were young before they moved to Bellflower in the Los Angeles area. So, they take a lot of punishment, and these guys like Stevenson, they may only fight 3-round fights, but they're in the gym all the time, and then they have so many of these big fights. And the intensity is there. I think overall amateurs probably are less damaged than the pros. They wear headgear, and they generally wear headgear, not always. And I think referees are more ready to step in and stop amateur fights than the pro fights, which generally often go too long.
His overall record as a boxer, as you noted, was 302 wins and 22 losses. It's just ridiculous to think that someone would fight that much. And he had an 11-year unbeaten streak, which ended in 1982 when he lost to Francisco Damiani, the first ever WBO champion. So he did fight a lot of champions. Just how good was this guy? How good was Stevenson?
Well, he was great. He was synonymous, as I say, since I was born the same year as Stevenson. And, I obviously and grew up with a lot of guys who were sports fans, and we discussed Stevenson frequently because he was just like you do, whether it's Willie Mays or Wilt Chamberlain,
right,
Michael Jordan, any great athlete, Tiger Woods, you're going to talk about this guy because he's exciting. So we all considered him a great athlete and a great fighter. We just considered that he just didn't reach his full potential because he stayed in the amateurs. Now, again, that is in no way a criticism because, as I say, I think that amateur fighters generally don't suffer the kind of brain damage that professional fighters do. But, of course, that's where the money is.
Sure.
In the pros.
Sure, and rather than turn professional, he was happier with the adoration of the Cuban people than with the potential millions he could have made fighting the likes of Ali. In fact,
That's
it's
right.
reported that he turned down $5 million to fight Muhammad Ali. So I'm guessing Fidel Castro must have taken good care of him because he did. He chose his country over wealth.
Yeah, I think Stevenson must have been in an emotional comfort zone in order to just say, hey, I like being an amateur. I like these 3-round fights. I like fighting for my country as well as myself. And I think that was his comfort zone, and he saw no reason. He may have sensed that the brutality of the professional game was far more severe than it was in the amateur. And he was just comfortable with that and didn't want to get involved with the additional punishment that was and is sustained by professional fighters.
You know, as the years pass, and we had just discussed this, as you alluded to, and he could no longer fight, he did fall on hard times. What was his life like after he fought?
Well, you know, as far as not that there's tremendous amount of information, but from talking to this Cuban, now Cuban American, who was in my class, from talking to him, reading this article by the aforementioned British writer, and just putting it together, and then just these little tidbits you see in articles about him having trouble. For example, this is actually, I think, after his career, he was an official, and he was in the airport in somewhere in Florida, probably Miami, and he headbutted one of the airline officials. Stevenson said that he was provoked, and the other guy said no, he wasn't. So he butted the guy, bloodied him, I think perhaps even loosened or knocked out some teeth. And in fact, Stevenson was allowed to get on the plane, and he never returned to the United States. So I think just when we read between the lines, we see that, I mean, we don't have any police reports or things like that, like, for example, these scrapes that he had with his 3 wives and 3 divorces and other women. But in the article I read about his last, really near the end, evidently, he was living in a rather modest place, but it did have a wall around it. And allegedly, women would have to make quick escapes either over the wall or through the gate. And that's not to say that Stevenson was a criminal or anything like that, but he was a man who was battling emotional problems and drinking problems and perhaps the effects of a long career in the ring.
Do you think he had any regrets when it came to boxing and not turning professional?
Well, he was asked that in the interview late in his life, and the one for which he was paid about $150, and he said he had no regrets. He said he had no regrets at all. Of course, he was intoxicated as he said that, but that may well be the case. I don't think Stevenson's problems late in life had anything to do with whether or not he feels he should have been a professional. I think he had other problems, evidently alcoholism and cigarette smoking. I think those were severe problems, and evidently he wasn't keeping busy enough. If a guy can get up in the morning and drink, it probably means that really he needs a job or something to really focus his attention on his energies. He had been a highly competitive guy since late teens, and a world-class fighter from late teens on, and then a dominant fighter in his 20s up through his mid-30s. So I think he was drifting, and really, I think part of it could have been the Cuban economy. I mean, what's a guy going to do in Cuba if he's committed to Cuba as he was? What is he going to do with his time in order to make money? Of course, he could have been a coach, and so again, I'm not going to blame the Cuban economic system or political system, but I think it could have been a factor. I think his options were limited on that island, and if he could have, for example, promoted fights like Oscar De La Hoya is doing now, or been a trainer like a lot of fighters do. But of course, most fighters who are trainers are not former superstars. But anyway, he just was literally hemmed in by those walls around his house, and just spent far too much time drinking.
But he did love the adoration of the Cuban public. That was worth it
absolutely.
To him.
Yeah, he loved it. He had a very special feeling. I was reviewing not only some of his fight films today, but films from his funeral. It was an open casket funeral. They had glass over his face, but it showed people crying, and their grief was palpable. He was the greatest sports hero I think that Cuba has ever had, and perhaps only second only to Fidel Castro as the second most popular guy in the history of the island. Certainly, he's one of the great heroes in the history of the island and the foremost athletic hero. And so, yes, he did have a very strong bond with Cuban people, and they with him.
What was his relationship with Fidel Castro like? Do you know?
I don't know any of the intimate details, but I think we can assume that since he's talked about his love for the Cuban people and the fact that he stayed there and he turned down millions of dollars in order to stay in Cuba and be part of that society, I think that we can be confident that he and Fidel were, at least at one time, were good friends. I don't know what... I'm sure they were very proud of each other's attention. The great leader, the comandante en jefe, anyone who has the attention of a chief of state is generally going to be flattered by it, and the chief of state is going to be flattered by the attention of a 3-time gold medal winner and an international celebrity as an athlete. Now, what did Castro think later on? Fidel, secret police, and so forth, certainly would have been aware that Stevenson had a very serious drinking problem. And the people of Cuba who loved him, undoubtedly, some of them who came in contact would have been aware of this too. So I don't know how that affected his personal relationship with Fidel. I don't know if Fidel perhaps distanced himself from Stevenson as Stevenson's problems worsened, or perhaps he reached out to Stevenson and tried to help him. I haven't been able to determine the nature of the relationship near the end of Stevenson's life.
Teofilo Stevenson really put Cuba on the map as an athletic power because of his prowess in the ring. Is that true?
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think people a lot of Cuban athletes just haven't had a chance to be known internationally. They were repressed, and in the case of some of them, like Stevenson, wouldn't have wanted to be pros anyway. But we've seen guys like El Duque, the pitcher, and others come from Cuba to the United States to make some money and to play on the grandest stage in the world. And but anyway, yes, he was the first huge star. I mean, he wasn't the first great athlete to come out of Cuba, but he was the first huge star, first superstar. And after that, I think people started taking a look at the great Cuban boxers. And also in the 1976 Olympics, he's perhaps not as well known now, but he was a huge star then. Alberto Guantarena, who was known as El Caballo, the horse, who became the first guy to win the 400 and the 800 meter runs in the same Olympics. And so you start with Stevenson, go move into Guantarena, and just in general, I think there's been a lot of appreciation for the Cuban boxers and track and field athletes, and of course the Cuban baseball players. Cuba, that's Cuba's greatest sport, really. Well, there they're awfully good at boxing, but they have great baseball players too. It's unfortunate we can't have perhaps now, with the passing of Castro, Obama's opening of the relations with Cuba, perhaps there can be a major league team in Havana someday, and the people of Havana would love it, and it would be a great opportunity for the Cuban players.
Sure.
To have Havana as a major league franchise in baseball.
Anything is possible. So let's look back at the ring for a second. So when comparing Stevenson to the other great boxers we are so familiar with, especially those who fought during the same time period, where would you rank Teofilo Stevenson?
You mean an all-time heavyweight list?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, I would have to do it based only on what we actually saw, rather than projecting him as a pro. We can be confident that he would be better. He would have been even better. He was great as an amateur, but he would have been even better had he developed as a pro. But based on the guy that I saw and the guy who was knocked out by Igor Vysotsky, I would have to say that he was, I would say throughout his career, he was probably at all times top 3 in the world.
Who else could you compare and say was just as powerful as Teofilo Stevenson to give us some sort of someone to compare Stevenson to?
I don't think I've ever seen anyone knock out as many people with single right hands as Stevenson. Ernie Shavers was a legend for his devastating right hand. But really, even Shavers, I think, would agree that Stevenson is really the single greatest right-hand knockout puncher in history.
Is there anything else we should know about Teofilo Stevenson that we haven't covered here today?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a great deal about him I would like to know. Just kind of, frankly, the behind-the-scenes stuff, which isn't necessarily our business, but when a person is a public figure and has some controversy and some difficulty, one wonders, okay, what was his life like at its core? Particularly, say, the last 20 years of his life. That, I think, is the story that people will be looking for, and I'm sure that some enterprising individual in the Caribbean will write that book. Perhaps someone already has. I'm not familiar with it, but it's a story that people would like to learn about. One of the most gifted fighters who's ever lived.
Tom, thank you again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Absolutely loved having you here. Again, tell our listeners where they can order your book, Death in the Ring, and discover more of your work.
Yeah, a good place to go is, my website is georgethomasclark.com. I go by Tom, but my full name is George Thomas Clark, and then the .com. And then Amazon. All my books, I've got 9 of them right now, are on Amazon. So Death in the Ring is available there. My most widely read book so far was my first book, which is Hitler Here, a biographical novel. So my website, georgethomasclark.com, and amazon.com. Just put in George Thomas Clark, and they can get a good overview of my work.
Well, thank you again, and I sure hope to have you on again in the near future.
Well, it was my pleasure. I'd be delighted to return anytime.
To see all Tom has written, please visit his website, georgethomasclark.com. His work is also available on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. That's georgethomasclark.com. It's amazing to me to see how different societies value different things. Here in the U.S., I think the pressure for Stevenson to turn professional would have been too great. But by all accounts, he was set up very nicely in Cuba and didn't need to turn to professional to enjoy a terrific lifestyle, at least by Cuban standards. Stevenson died young, though. He was just 60 when he suffered a fatal heart attack on June 11, 2012. His career record is not listed in cement. Nonetheless, he won over 300 fights, absolutely incredible. And he lost only 20. Again, absolutely incredible. Would he have made a great professional? Well, like Clark said, he beat eventual world champions, and one can only dream what the pro game would have been like for Stevenson had he trained for fights to go longer than 3 rounds. Guess we'll never know, just like we'll never know if the Yankees of the 20s could have beaten the Yankees of the 50s. Or what would have happened if Michael Jordan's Bulls played the Bill Russell version of the Celtics. Or if Jack Nicklaus and Ben Hogan could have dueled it out on the golf course when both were in their primes. That's the great thing about sports. A lot of conjecture and great barroom discussions. For more on Sports Forgotten Heroes, please visit our page at patreon.com/sportsfh. That's patreon.com/sportsfh. You could even learn how to participate in a future podcast. Again, patreon.com/sportsfh. Check out our website, sportsfh.com. Follow us on Twitter at SportsFHeroes or search for our page on Facebook, Sports Forgotten Heroes. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll take a look back at the career of a terrific golfer, the 1964 British Open champion, Champagne Tony Lima. Thanks again to Tom Clark, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.